I thought I knew everything about my wife of 40 years, until a sign in the lobby of her company introduced me to a son I never knew existed. My name is Daniel Walker, and at 67 years old, I believe there were very few surprises left in life. Catherine and I had been married for 4 decades. We had built a quiet life together in a suburb outside Chicago, shared countless holiday dinners, survived financial struggles in our younger years, and celebrated the success that eventually came when her business grew into one of the most respected consulting firms in the Midwest. Most people looked at us and saw a success story. To be honest, so did I. That Tuesday morning began like any other. I woke up just after 6, made a pot of coffee, and watched the sunrise paint the backyard in shades of gold. Catherine had already left for the office. As CEO, she often started her day before anyone else. She had always been driven, disciplined, and focused. Those were qualities I admired. Around 10 o'clock, I decided to do something spontaneous. Catherine's company was celebrating its 20th anniversary that week, and although she rarely invited me to corporate events, I thought it might be nice to stop by with lunch and surprise her. I picked up her favorite grilled chicken salad from a cafe near the office and drove downtown. The company headquarters occupied a modern 12-story building of glass and steel. I had seen photographs before, but standing in front of it made me feel proud. My wife had built this. From a tiny rented office with 2 employees to a company worth millions. I parked across the street and took a moment to admire the building before heading inside. The lobby was larger than I expected. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows. Employees moved confidently between security gates and elevators. Near the reception desk stood a large bronze display commemorating the company's 20th anniversary. I walked toward it while waiting for the receptionist to finish helping another visitor. At first, I barely paid attention. Then my eyes settled on the engraved inscription. Founded by Catherine Walker and her son, Ethan Walker. I read it once, then again, then a third time. The words didn't change. Founded by Catherine Walker and her son, Ethan Walker. My hands tightened around the paper bag holding her lunch. Son. The word echoed in my mind. Catherine and I never had children. We had talked about it many times when we were younger. Life had taken us in different directions, and eventually we accepted that our family would remain just the 2 of us. So who was Ethan Walker? I stepped closer to the display. Beneath the inscription were photographs from the company's early years. In one picture, Catherine appeared much younger, standing beside a teenage boy with dark hair and a confident smile. The caption identified him as Ethan Walker. My pulse quickened. I had never seen him before. Not in our home. Not in family albums. Not in any story Catherine had ever told me. "Can I help you, sir?" a cheerful voice asked behind me. I turned and found the receptionist smiling politely. "I'm here to see Catherine Walker," I said. "I'm her husband." The receptionist's smile froze for just a fraction of a second. It was subtle, but I noticed it. Then she quickly recovered. "Of course, Mr. Walker. Please have a seat. I'll let her office know you're here." As I walked toward the waiting area, I glanced back at the display one more time. Across the lobby, several employees had begun looking in my direction. Most immediately looked away when our eyes met. One woman near the elevators appeared genuinely shocked to see me there. Something felt wrong. Not strange. Not confusing. Wrong. The kind of feeling you get when a puzzle piece suddenly appears from a completely different box. I sat down and stared through the glass walls overlooking the city. For 20 years, my wife had built a company around someone named Ethan Walker. A son I had never heard of. And judging by the reactions around me, I was beginning to realize something even more unsettling. Everyone in that building seemed to know who Ethan was. Everyone except me. I remained in that chair for nearly 10 minutes, watching employees move through the lobby while pretending to study the skyline beyond the windows. The longer I sat there, the more I noticed small details that should have meant nothing but suddenly felt important. A group of younger employees walked past the anniversary display and casually pointed toward the photograph of Catherine and Ethan. An older gentleman in a tailored suit stopped to admire the bronze plaque before heading toward the elevators. No one looked surprised by the existence of Ethan Walker. The only person struggling to understand what he was seeing was me. I tried to convince myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Perhaps Ethan was a nephew. Maybe a distant relative who had helped Catherine in the early years of the business. Yet that explanation fell apart the moment I remembered the inscription. It did not say partner. It did not say relative. It said son. The word had been chosen carefully and permanently engraved in bronze. My thoughts drifted backward through the years. Catherine had always been private about certain parts of her past. When we first met, she was ambitious and determined, working long hours while attending business classes at night. I admired her independence. If she avoided discussing certain chapters of her life, I assumed everyone had things they preferred to leave behind. Over time, those unanswered questions simply became part of our marriage. Looking back, I realized how many opportunities there had been to ask more questions. There were old photo albums she kept in storage boxes and rarely opened. There were family gatherings she attended alone because she claimed they involved distant relatives I would not know. There were occasional phone calls she would take in another room before returning with a vague explanation that never quite explained anything. At the time, none of it seemed suspicious. Now every memory felt different, as though someone had adjusted the lighting on scenes I thought I understood. The receptionist eventually picked up her phone and spoke quietly for a few seconds. When she hung up, she smiled at me. Mrs. Walker is currently in a board meeting. She asked if you would be willing to wait a little longer. I nodded. Of course. Another 10 minutes passed. Then 15. During that time, I noticed a woman standing near a hallway entrance. She appeared to be in her late 30s, dressed professionally, holding a tablet against her chest. Every few moments she glanced toward me before quickly looking away. Finally, she took a breath and started walking in my direction. Something about her expression caught my attention immediately. It was not curiosity. It was concern. She stopped a few feet away. Mr. Walker? She asked softly. Yes. My name is Olivia Parker. I am Catherine's executive assistant. I stood and offered my hand. She shook it politely, though her grip felt tense. Nice to meet you. Olivia forced a smile. You too. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She seemed to be choosing her words carefully. Then her eyes shifted briefly toward the anniversary display behind me. I did not think you would ever come here, she said. The sentence landed harder than she probably intended. I stared at her. What does that mean? Her face immediately changed. Nothing. I am sorry. That came out wrong. No, I said calmly. It sounded like you expected me not to be here. Olivia glanced around the lobby as though checking who might be listening. The confidence she carried when she first approached me seemed to disappear. I really should not be having this conversation. My pulse quickened. Conversation about what? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Before she could answer, the elevator doors opened across the lobby. Several executives stepped out, including Catherine. The moment Olivia saw her, all the color drained from her face. And for the first time in 40 years of marriage, when my wife looked at me, she did not appear happy to see me. She looked frightened. For a few seconds, neither Catherine nor I moved. The executives around her continued their conversations, unaware that something had shifted between us. My wife recovered first. A practiced smile appeared on her face, the same confident expression I had seen at charity events and business dinners for years. Yet now I noticed how forced it looked. Daniel, she said as she approached. What a surprise. I handed her the paper bag containing her lunch. I thought I would stop by and see your office. You should have called. The answer came too quickly. Catherine immediately softened her tone. I mean, I would have loved to prepare for your visit. I nodded slowly. I am sure you would have. Her eyes flickered toward the anniversary display. Only for a moment, but it was enough. She knew exactly what I had seen. Olivia stood frozen beside us. Catherine turned toward her assistant. Olivia, could you give us a few minutes? Of course. Olivia looked at me briefly before walking away. There was something in her expression that felt almost apologetic. Catherine placed a hand gently on my arm. Why do not we go upstairs? She asked. My office is more comfortable. We entered a private elevator reserved for executives. During the ride to the 12th floor, neither of us spoke. The silence felt unfamiliar. For 40 years, Catherine had always known how to fill uncomfortable moments. Today she seemed unable to find the words. Her office occupied the corner of the building. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Chicago. Awards lined the walls. Framed magazine covers displayed her achievements. Any other day, I would have been proud. Instead, my attention settled on a photograph sitting near her desk. It showed Catherine standing beside several employees at a company event. My eyes immediately found the same young man from the lobby display. Ethan. Catherine quietly closed the office door behind us. Daniel, she began. There is an explanation. I looked at the photograph. I hope so. She walked toward her desk, but remained standing. You are upset. I think that is a reasonable reaction. Her shoulders lowered slightly. I wanted to tell you. I let out a short laugh. When? She looked away. The answer never came. I stepped closer to the photograph. The young man appeared to be in his late 20s. He was smiling beside Catherine with an ease that suggested years of familiarity. Not the familiarity of co-workers. Family. Who is he? I asked. Catherine remained silent. The plaque says he is your son. More silence. The photographs say the same thing. She slowly sat down. Suddenly, she looked older than 65. Not weaker, just tired. As if she had spent years carrying something heavy. Daniel, some parts of my life happened before I met you. That is not what concerns me. My voice remained calm, but I could feel my heartbeat in my chest. What concerns me is that every person in this building appears to know something about your life that your husband does not. Catherine closed her eyes briefly. The room fell quiet again. Outside the windows, traffic moved through the city streets hundreds of feet below. Finally, she opened a desk drawer and removed an old photograph. Her hands trembled slightly as she slid it across the desk toward me. I picked it up. The picture was faded with age. A much younger Catherine stood beside a small boy who could not have been more than 8 years old. Written across the bottom in black ink were 3 words. Summer 2004. Ethan and Mom. I stared at the photograph for several long seconds. Then I looked up at my wife. And in that moment, I realized the mystery was much bigger than a hidden name on a plaque. Ethan was real. Ethan had been part of her life for decades, which meant Catherine had not hidden a secret from me for a few months or even a few years. She had hidden it for most of our marriage. The photograph remained in my hands long after Catherine stopped speaking. I studied every detail. The faded colors, the young smile on her face, the way the boy stood comfortably beside her as though he belonged there. Nothing about the image felt staged. It looked like a memory that had been cherished for years. The problem was simple. I had never seen it before. How old was he? I finally asked. Catherine folded her hands together. 8. I looked down at the date again. Summer 2004. My stomach tightened. In 2004, Catherine and I had already been married for nearly 18 years. We were living in the same house we still own today. We ate dinner together almost every night. We took vacations together. We shared birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, and countless ordinary days. Yet somehow an entire child had existed beyond the edges of my life, without my knowledge. Where was he? I asked quietly. Catherine stared at the city skyline beyond the glass walls. Safe. The answer only created more questions. Safe from what? She did not respond. I set the photograph carefully on her desk. Anger would have been easier. Anger creates noise. Anger creates movement. What I felt instead was something colder. Confusion. The kind that slowly spreads through every memory until nothing feels solid anymore. I began replaying years of our marriage inside my head. Business trips that lasted longer than expected. Weekend conferences I never attended. Phone calls that ended when I entered the room. I had always trusted her explanations because trust was what marriage required. Now each memory returned carrying a different weight. Did anyone else know? I asked. Catherine remained silent for several seconds. That silence was answer enough. The board knows, do not they? She lowered her eyes. Some of them. The executives? Another pause. Yes. I nodded slowly. Every employee who had glanced at me in the lobby. Every uncomfortable expression. Every nervous look suddenly made sense. They were not reacting to a stranger. They were reacting to a man who had accidentally discovered he was the last person to learn the truth. A soft knock interrupted us. Before either of us could respond, the office door opened slightly. Olivia stood there holding a folder. I am sorry to interrupt, she said carefully. The board meeting resumes in 15 minutes. Catherine thanked her. Olivia hesitated. Her eyes briefly met mine. Again I saw that same look. Concern. Almost sympathy. Then she quietly closed the door. Something about her behavior stayed with me. Olivia was not acting like someone protecting a company secret. She was acting like someone worried about what I had not yet discovered. I turned back toward Catherine. Is Ethan alive? Her head lifted immediately. Of course he is. Relief flashed across her face so quickly that it almost escaped my notice. It was the first genuine emotion I had seen from her all afternoon. Not fear. Not guilt. Relief. I filed that reaction away. It mattered. Where is he now? I asked. Catherine stood up and walked toward the window. Daniel, there are things about this story you do not understand yet. Then help me understand. She wrapped her arms around herself and stared down at the streets far below. For the first time since I had entered the building, she looked uncertain. Not like a chief executive. Not like the woman who controlled boardrooms and negotiated million-dollar contracts. Just a person standing in front of consequences she could no longer avoid. Then she said something that changed everything. Daniel, Ethan is not the secret I was trying to hide. For several seconds I simply stared at her. Because if Ethan was not the secret, then whatever truth had been buried for 20 years was far bigger than I had imagined. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Catherine remained by the window, staring out at the city she had spent 2 decades helping build around her success. I sat across from her desk trying to understand what I had just heard. If Ethan was not the secret, then everything I had assumed since entering the building was wrong. What does that mean? I asked quietly. Catherine turned toward me. There was exhaustion in her eyes now. Not the exhaustion of a long workday. The exhaustion that comes from carrying a burden for years. It means Ethan is real, she said. It means he has always been part of my life. But he is not the reason I kept so many things hidden. I leaned back in my chair. Then tell me the reason. She opened her mouth, but stopped herself. Whatever answer she wanted to give seemed trapped somewhere behind years of silence. Instead, she walked to a cabinet near her desk and removed a thick photo album. She placed it in front of me. Start here. I opened the cover. The first pages contained photographs from the early years of the company. Small offices, folding tables, employees celebrating milestones. Then I noticed something unusual. Ethan appeared in nearly every photograph. Sometimes he was helping set up equipment. Sometimes he was carrying boxes. Sometimes he stood proudly beside Catherine during company events. He looked happy, comfortable, important. As I turned the pages, I realized I was looking at a history everyone inside this company knew by heart. A history that had been completely hidden from me. Why would you keep all of this here? I asked. Catherine smiled sadly. Because this is the only place where I never had to pretend. The answer settled heavily in the room. I continued flipping through the album. Then another detail caught my attention. In several photographs, Ethan stood beside an older woman. She appeared repeatedly across different years and events. Company picnics, holiday parties, award ceremonies. Whoever she was, she seemed deeply connected to both Ethan and Catherine. I pointed at one picture. Who is she? Catherine looked down at the photograph. For the first time that afternoon, genuine emotion crossed her face. Her name was Margaret Sullivan. The name sounded familiar. Then I remembered. One of the company founders listed in several business articles I had read years ago. A former board member. Someone who retired nearly a decade earlier. Margaret helped build the company? I asked. Catherine nodded. More than anyone knows. There was something significant in the way she said it. Something unfinished. Before I could ask another question, a notification appeared on Catherine's computer screen. She glanced at it and immediately became tense. What is it? I asked. She hesitated. Margaret is here. I stared at her. Here. She rarely visits the office anymore. Catherine's expression darkened. Which means she probably knows you are here. A strange feeling settled over me. The same feeling I had experienced in the lobby. The sense that events were moving according to a plan I did not understand. Catherine looked toward the door. Daniel, if Margaret wants to speak with you, please listen carefully. Why? Her answer came almost as a whisper. Because she knows the part of the story I never had the courage to tell. At that exact moment, there was a knock on the office door. The door opened slowly, and an elderly woman stepped inside with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Margaret Sullivan looked older than the photographs in the album, but there was no mistaking her sharp eyes or steady posture. She carried no briefcase, no folder, nothing except a small leather purse. Yet the moment she entered the room, the atmosphere changed. Catherine stood immediately. Margaret. The older woman nodded once. Catherine. Then her attention shifted to me. For several seconds, she simply studied my face. Finally, she smiled, though there was sadness behind it. You must be Daniel. I rose from my chair and extended my hand. And you must be Margaret. She shook my hand warmly. I have wanted to meet you for many years. The statement caught me off guard. Many years. Not months. Not recently. Years. Margaret glanced toward Catherine. May we have a few minutes alone? Catherine looked as though she wanted to object. Instead, she slowly nodded. Without another word, she left the office and closed the door behind her. The silence that followed felt heavy. Margaret moved to the window and stared out across the city. This company looks very different from when we started. I sat back down. Catherine said, you know the part of the story she never told me. Margaret sighed softly. I was afraid this day would eventually come. Then it is true? I asked. There really is more. She turned toward me. Much more. My chest tightened. Margaret took a seat across from me and folded her hands together. Before I tell you anything, you need to understand something. Catherine never hid the truth because she wanted to hurt you. Then why hide it at all? Margaret looked down for a moment. Because she believed she was protecting someone. I thought about Ethan. Protecting her son? Margaret slowly shook her head. No. That answer stopped me cold. Every assumption I had made over the past few hours suddenly felt uncertain again. Then who was she protecting? Margaret did not answer immediately. Instead, she opened her purse and removed a worn photograph. The edges were faded from age. She carefully placed it on the desk between us. I looked down. The image showed a much younger Catherine standing beside Ethan. But there was someone else in the picture. A man. He appeared to be around 30 years old. He stood beside them with one arm around the boy's shoulder. The three of them looked like a family. My eyes remained fixed on the photograph. Who is he? Margaret's expression softened. That is the question that changed everything 20 years ago. I felt my pulse quicken. Is he Ethan's father? Margaret nodded. Yes. The room seemed unusually quiet. Traffic moved outside. Phones rang somewhere beyond the office walls. Yet all I could hear was my own heartbeat. Where is he now? I asked. Margaret's gaze settled on the photograph. That is exactly what Catherine spent 20 years trying to find out. I stared at her. Find out. Margaret nodded again. Because one day, without warning, he disappeared. And when he vanished, he took a secret with him that affected far more lives than anyone realized. She pointed toward the photograph. Daniel, before you assume anything else, you need to know this. The greatest mystery was never Ethan. The greatest mystery was the man standing beside him. Margaret allowed the silence to linger after her last sentence. I kept staring at the photograph on the desk, searching the stranger's face for something familiar. There was confidence in his posture, warmth in his smile, and an ease that suggested he belonged beside Catherine and Ethan. Yet I had never seen him before in my life. What was his name? I finally asked. Margaret leaned back in her chair. Thomas Reed. The name meant nothing to me. He helped start the company? Margaret nodded slowly. In many ways, it was his vision that inspired everything that came later. Catherine handled operations. I handled finances. Thomas was the dreamer. He saw opportunities where everyone else saw obstacles. I glanced at the photograph again. And then he disappeared? Yes. Margaret folded her hands together. One day he simply stopped showing up. He missed meetings. He stopped answering calls. His apartment was empty. His bank accounts were untouched. It was as though he stepped out of his life and never returned. I frowned. And nobody found him. Not for lack of trying. Margaret's expression darkened. Catherine spent years looking. That detail surprised me more than I expected. Throughout the afternoon, I had viewed the mystery through the lens of my own confusion. I had focused on the secrets hidden from me. For the first time, I began to consider what those years might have looked like from Catherine's perspective. If Thomas truly vanished without explanation, then perhaps she had been living with unanswered questions of her own. Were they close? I asked carefully. Margaret's eyes met mine. Very. The answer hung between us. Not dramatic. Not sensational. Just honest. I nodded slowly. Before she met me? Yes. I felt an unexpected sense of relief. Whatever this story was becoming, it was not the story I had feared when I first saw the plaque downstairs. Margaret seemed to notice the shift in my expression. Daniel, you need to understand something. Catherine never stopped believing she would find answers. Even after all these years. Margaret gave a small smile. Especially after all these years. I stood and walked toward the office window. The city stretched for miles beneath us. Cars moved through intersections. People hurried along sidewalks. Entire lives unfolding without any awareness of the conversations taking place above them. If Thomas disappeared before I entered her life, I said, then why hide all of this from me? Margaret was quiet for a moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before. Because the longer she waited for answers, the harder it became to explain the silence. I turned back toward her. That cannot be the whole reason. No. She looked down at the photograph again. It is not. My pulse quickened. There it was again. Another layer beneath the layer. Another door behind the door I had just opened. Margaret reached into her purse and removed a sealed envelope. The paper looked old, its edges slightly worn. She placed it carefully on the desk. 3 weeks ago, this arrived at my home. I stared at it. What is it? Margaret's eyes locked onto mine. The first communication anyone has received from Thomas Reed in more than 20 years. The room seemed to shrink around me. You are saying he is alive? Margaret nodded once. And according to the letter, he is finally ready to tell the truth about why he disappeared. Margaret slid the envelope across the desk. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. 20 years. 20 years of silence reduced to a few sheets of paper hidden inside an ordinary envelope. The idea felt impossible. Did Catherine read it? I asked. Margaret nodded. The day it arrived, I looked toward the office door. Everything suddenly made more sense. The tension in Catherine's face. The fear I had seen when she first spotted me in the lobby. She had not been afraid of me discovering Ethan. She had been afraid of what might happen once the past finally caught up with the present. What does the letter say? Margaret took a slow breath. Not enough. She carefully opened the envelope and removed several pages. The paper looked newer than the envelope itself, as though it had been copied many times. Thomas did not explain everything. He only revealed enough to arrange a meeting. My pulse quickened. A meeting? Tomorrow morning. I stared at her. He wants to meet after 20 years? Yes. Margaret handed me the first page. The handwriting was neat and deliberate. I immediately noticed how personal the message felt. Thomas addressed Margaret by name. He referenced specific events from the company's earliest days, details that would have been impossible for anyone else to know. There was no doubt the letter was genuine. I continued reading. Thomas apologized for the pain his disappearance had caused. He acknowledged the years of uncertainty. He admitted that many people deserved answers. Yet one sentence stood apart from everything else. I read it twice, then a third time. The greatest mistake was allowing Daniel Walker to live inside a story that was never true. My hands became still. Margaret watched me carefully. You understand now why Catherine was terrified. I looked up from the page. He knew my name. Apparently, he always did. The room felt strangely unsteady. Until that moment, I had assumed I was standing outside the mystery, looking inward. Suddenly, I realized I might be standing at its center. I continued reading. Thomas never explained what he meant. Instead, he wrote that the full truth could only be shared in person. The final page included an address outside Milwaukee and a time for the meeting. 10 o'clock the next morning. I set the papers down. Has Catherine agreed to go? Margaret nodded. She plans to leave before sunrise. I laughed quietly, though there was no humor in it. And she still was not going to tell me. Margaret's expression softened. Daniel, people sometimes hide things for so long that secrecy becomes habit, even when the truth is finally within reach. I looked out the window. Clouds had begun gathering over the city. The sunlight that filled the office earlier had faded into a dull gray afternoon. Somewhere beyond those clouds was a man who had disappeared for 2 decades and suddenly returned with answers. Answers about Catherine, about Ethan, and somehow about me. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. The office door opened, and Catherine stepped inside. The moment she saw the letter on the desk, she stopped. Her eyes moved from Margaret to me. Neither of us spoke. Then Catherine looked directly at the pages in front of me and whispered 5 words that made my stomach drop. He was never supposed to return. The office became completely silent. Catherine stood near the door, her face pale and her eyes fixed on the letter. Margaret lowered her gaze as though she had heard those words many times before. I remained seated, trying to understand what Catherine had just said. What do you mean he was never supposed to return? I asked. Catherine slowly walked toward the desk. For the first time that day, she looked directly at me without avoiding my eyes. Because 20 years ago, we were told he was gone forever. I frowned. By who? Catherine sat down across from me. By Thomas himself. She took a deep breath. A month before he disappeared, Thomas came to me with information that changed everything. He had discovered that someone inside a larger corporation was trying to acquire our company through dishonest means. He gathered evidence. He planned to expose it. Then one night, he told me something I never forgot. Her voice softened. He said that if anything happened, I needed to protect Ethan and move forward without him. I listened carefully. Catherine continued. A few weeks later, he vanished. Then a letter arrived. It was written in his handwriting. It said he was leaving voluntarily and that nobody should try to find him. I glanced at the envelope on the desk. And you believed it? Catherine looked down. I wanted to believe it because the alternative was worse. Margaret nodded quietly. We all believed it. The pieces finally began fitting together. Years of silence. Years of uncertainty. Years spent building a company while carrying questions that never disappeared. But that still does not explain me, I said. Catherine's eyes filled with emotion. No, it does not. She reached into a drawer and removed a small folder. The edges were worn from age. She handed it to me. Inside was a collection of documents, photographs, and handwritten notes. At the bottom was a single sheet of paper. I immediately recognized the name written across the top. Daniel Walker. My heart skipped a beat. What is this? Catherine folded her hands together. Thomas left it with Margaret before he disappeared. I unfolded the page. It was dated 21 years earlier, long before I ever knew any of this existed. The message was short, direct, and impossible to forget. If anything happens to me, there is one person I trust to help them build a future. Daniel Walker. I read the sentence again. Then again. He knew me? I whispered. Catherine nodded. You and Thomas attended the same business leadership conference years before we met. You barely remembered him, but he remembered you. My mind raced through distant memories. A conference hotel, a networking event, hundreds of faces. One of them must have been Thomas Reed. After he disappeared, Catherine continued, Margaret showed me his letter. He believed you were the kind of man who would always put family before himself. Years later, when we met, I never told you the connection. At first it seemed unnecessary. Then too much time passed. Then even more time passed. Eventually I became trapped inside my own silence. I stared at her. Not with anger. Not anymore. Just understanding. The secret had never been about replacing me. It had never been about hiding another life. It had been about fear. Fear that the truth would arrive too late. Fear that decades of silence could never be explained. I carefully placed the letter back into the folder. Outside the office windows, the clouds had begun to break apart, allowing sunlight to spill across the city once again. So what happens tomorrow? I asked. Catherine looked toward the envelope, then toward me. Tomorrow we finally get answers. I nodded slowly. For 20 years, Catherine had been waiting for the return of a man who vanished without explanation. For 40 years, I believed I knew every chapter of my marriage. Yet sitting in that office, I realized something important. The strongest relationships are not built on knowing every secret from the beginning. They are built on having the courage to face the truth when it finally arrives.